What's up, YouTube? Zach here, back with another political video talking about paleocons, and I want to talk about why they're so dangerous to the Republican Party and thus the world. I also want to talk about how they're different from neocons, and I'm going to do some serious gatekeeping here and explain to you how paleocons are not real conservatives and they haven't been since the 50s. And we're going to start with a little game here. I'm going to put up some political figures, and you play along at home, guess in your head whether or not you think these guys are neocons, paleocons, or some other third thing. So let's get started here with an easy one. George W. Bush. What do you think? Neocon. Of course, right? That's an easy one. Known for the Iraq War. Neocon through and through. Great example of one. Next, let's move on to Donald Trump. What do you think of him? Neocon? Paleocon? Neither. That's the truth. He's a populist. He has some paleoconservative tendencies. He has some neoconservative tendencies. He's a beast of the polls, and he's not very ideological at the end of the day. Next, we got good old Benji, Ben Shapiro. You guys think Ben Shapiro's a neocon? You'd be right. You would be right. Traditional Zionist neocon. Let's go to Nick Fuentes. What do you think of that? Definitely not a neocon, right? You might be thinking, he's not a paleoconservative, he's a Nazi, right? Or something like that. But I'm going to disagree. I think he is just a hardcore paleoconservative. And I think that his brand of anti-Semitism is very compatible with paleoconservative. I don't think he can be called a national socialist, because he doesn't believe in socialism like the Nazis did. Can't really be called a fascist because, I mean, he hates Marxism, and he's a race realist. Both of those things not super compatible with fascism. Next, let's talk about Ronald Reagan. Another easy one, right? Neocon. You're noticing a lot of neocons are pretty based, aren't you? Yes. We have a great track record. A little more difficult one. Alex Jones. Political figure of some sort. What do you think he is? He says a lot of paleoconservative things, doesn't he? For sure. But truth is, he's a comedian. He's not a real paleoconservative. This is a trick question. Alex Jones is a comedian. Next, let's talk about Ayn Rand. Another bit of a tricky one. You might want to call her a neocon, right? She has a ton of neocon tendencies. She is relatively based, but she has carved out her own niche that is distinct from neoconservatism. It's called objectivism. You could call it Ayn Randism if you want, because that seems to be what her followers are really obsessed with. And she is not a neocon for a couple reasons. One, there's a religious thing, which was a big sticking point. And an atheist can certainly hate Islam and be very tough on foreign policy. We see that a lot. But it's not a conservative position. And that's kind of the problem with Ayn Rand's ideology and classifying her with a neocon, is that she's not really conservative in the sense that she wants to preserve the status quo of America. She has pretty radical ideas and a vision for the future that's different from the zeitgeist of current America, which is what neocons generally support. And last one here, Obama. What do you guys think? Alright, if any of you said Obama was a conservative, you're wrong. I don't know what to tell you. He's not a neocon. He's not a paleocon. He's just a leftist. I mean, I would try to classify individual leftists, but they have a tendency to, like, self-aggrandize all of their names. Like, we're progressives. Okay. Like, Republican classifications are a little more sterile and bookish, aren't they? Alright, now that we've given some examples of figures in politics and how they fall on this dichotomy here, let's more rigidly define the dichotomy. Neocon is... Let's read the internet version for a second, and then I'll rephrase. Neoconservatives typically advocate for the promotion of democracy and interventionism in international affairs, including peace through strength, and are known for espousing disdain for communism and political radicalism. This is pretty accurate by my summation as a neocon. I might just add the caveat that neocons really try to believe in foreign policy realism, and it's not just ideological strength for the sake of strength, it's strength when it's called for and isolationism when it's called for. Paleoconservatives, internet defines them as conservatives in the United States who stress American nationalism, Christian ethics, regionalism, and traditional conservatism. And I want to emphasize that last bit, traditional conservatism. So, in other words, an outdated form of conservatism that doesn't fit with the times of today. And that really is my summation of the big problem with paleocons, is they haven't caught up with the reality of the situations on the ground in the 21st century. They want to go back to a time where isolationism as a foreign policy was very viable for America, and this was pre-World War II. Foreign policy at the time was isolationist to a large extent, and it was completely rational for it to be that way. But post-World War II, when America became the hegemonic power of the world, then America was put in a position where we really just have no choice but to intervene in certain affairs, because if we don't intervene, it's going to create a power vacuum, and you'll see a drastic decrease in not just American power, but the power of liberal democracies globally. Foreign policy is probably the key factor that people like to distinguish between these two groups. And that's totally fair. It's one of the things they get most heated about. But another aspect is corporatism. Neocons seem much more willing to accept the libertarian approach. For example, private companies censoring conservatives. Neocons are less likely to be angry about this. Neocons are less likely to be upset about employers hiring immigrants, even if they're illegal. Things like this. And Paleocons are distinct from neocons in that way, and in a lot of the ways they become left-wing and anti-Semites in their economic approach. They had this tendency to become anti-free market in a very significant way. Supporting radical tariffs, which is very bunk economic policy. It's a viable foreign policy if you're trying to target China to make China weak or something. It's really like sanctions along those lines. As an economic policy, it is not as viable. Now, I want to give some paleoconservatives some credit here. They've been a dominant voice in the culture since Trump got elected, largely. And I think they're right on a couple issues. That as a neocon, I've adapted my thinking a little bit more towards that direction on. For example, internet censorship. I certainly think that if companies like Twitter are censoring conservatives exclusively, something should be done about this. It's obviously unfair to conservatives, and what's unfair to conservatives is bad for the world. However, I am still of the mind that what I would really want is just for all political discussion to just be banned from the internet, including myself. All right, political discussion on the internet contributes no value to society. It's a net negative on society. It should just be gotten away with. We'd all be happier. We'd all be healthier, and the government would probably be doing better. Another thing that really Trump kind of convinced me on was that tariffs can be used in some capacity. I mentioned this a little bit already. I was wrong about Trump's tariffs, specifically on China. The tariffs against our allies made no goddamn sense. That was ridiculous. Why are you trying to like strong arm Europe and Canada? I don't get that. But China was sweating bullets. I mean, I really wish Biden had maintained that policy of harsh tariffs on China. I don't think they were handling it well at all. And what's bad for China is good for the world. So those are a couple things that I give Paleocons credit on. But I think this is all massively outweighed by the dangers of the ideology and the pipeline that it creates towards things like eco-fascism. You know, the worst kind of shit. And this problem comes in two folds. Although it's kind of just one big problem. The big problem, and this is the problem with leftism too, is that it's just anti-establishment. It's just anti-status quo, largely for the sake of being anti-status quo. It's distrust in government officials, just because it's a very trendy and popular thing to think there's a deep state, or that our politicians are worse than incompetent, or that our presidents are all exactly the same and they're all just puppets of some greater force, right? This is very dangerous thinking. It's conspiratorial thinking that leaves individuals vulnerable to all sorts of predacious ideologies. And this is why you see paleoconservatives trending towards anti-Semitism in a big way. Neocons, I mean, we get accused of being Jew shills. There's an entire chart here I'll show you, created by some paleoconservative somewhere, that is highlighting how all of neoconservatism is just this offshoot of Trotskyism, an anti-Stalinist leftism, which there's a grain of truth to it. I mean, you'll see that this graph is pretty ridiculous. Not only does it have Ayn Rand as a neocon, but it has her as influencing the National Review, which is not accurate. But this chart is a great window into the dangers of paleoconservatism. So I think this trend towards conspiratorial thinking on the internet has largely emboldened paleoconservatives. They've taken advantage of it in a massive way. Listen, it's my position that anybody who opposes the status quo is evil on multiple levels. I really don't think that overturning the status quo has ever achieved anything good in the history of politics. This is what leftists do. Their job is to criticize and change the status quo. And this is also largely what paleoconservatives seek to do. They are very confused. They think that going back in time is what being a conservative is. Like if we all go back to pre-agricultural days, that this is like peak conservatism, when really actually that's far closer to socialism and communist ideology and anarchist ideology. This concept of man's original sin, we need to go backwards. A conservative really is just about preserving the status quo. It's about being a shill for the zeitgeist, right? And this is good for a few reasons. Not only does it preserve the zeitgeist, which in America I generally think is objectively good and will continue to be good for many, many centuries, hopefully. I just think that this is good on an individual psychological level for individuals to not engage with politics in that way, and to generally just be blind sheep. I know that sounds a little bit ridiculous, but I really just, I'm kind of engaging in anti-intellectualism here. I don't think that people should be digesting politics in any capacity. I don't think they benefit from doing so. I think the only people that benefit from the population consuming politics are political radicals, and that's always been that way. So I guess what I'm saying is that the problem with paleoconservatism is that it cannot advocate for political apathy. And political apathy is, I find, the only moral position to advocate for, because it's the only one that genuinely helps individuals. I was going to end this video, but I just realized I got to talk about the biggest name in paleoconservatism, and one of the biggest names in conservatism that reaches the most amount of people, and that's Tucker Carlson, and the harm that he's done to the Republican Party. First of all, I want to give a surface level criticism for Tucker Carlson, and that's that every time I tune in to his show, he's making the exact same face, like he's just lost all faith in humanity, and that's just his default setting, and that's what you get when you tune into his show. It's despair. It's borders on sarcastic terrorism. I'm not saying left-wing media doesn't do this too. I'm just talking about Tucker Carlson right now. He's far too moralistic in his news coverage, and gets people really worked up. I really think that paleoconservatism is the only reason we ever see conservatives out protesting, which I always find embarrassing. Whether it's the truckers in Canada or the Jan 6 rioters, or even just anti-maskers. I just don't think, I don't think anybody should be protesting, and I definitely don't think conservatives should be protesting. And a lot of his rhetoric kind of just seems to drive people out to the streets. So that's one problem. He's too moralistic. The other problem is he's just very wrong on very serious issues. He continues to contend that the election is stolen, and this is something that I find extremely embarrassing from Republicans. This contention was just ridiculous on its surface. It was thrown out by 70 judges, many of which appointed by Trump. Another thing that Tucker Carlson is contributing to is this sentiment against Ukraine, not wanting to participate in Ukraine. A lot of conservatives online are very upset that $40 billion were given to Ukrainians instead of to the American people, which would have been a disastrous policy to give the American people $40 billion, obviously. I mean, that's kind of what Democrats do on a daily basis. The $40 billion to Ukraine was necessary if you think that keeping Russia out of Ukraine was important. And I do think it is important. I also think that Biden is responsible for Russia invading Ukraine in a very big way. So I still blame him for that $40 billion going down the hole. But that $40 billion does need to be spent. Ukraine does need to be saved. But Tucker Carlson doesn't just contribute to this. He goes as far as to play propaganda for Russia. He'll go into this rhetoric about how Russia is surrounded by American military bases and how it's a threat to Russian national security that Ukraine wants to join the EU or NATO or any country bordering Russia might want to do that. And these are just completely ridiculous arguments. I don't understand how any conservative can be convinced of this. I mean, Russia was an evil empire its entire existence. Of course we have bases around there. It was the Soviet Union. And Ukraine has all the right in the world to join whatever international organization it wants to. What the hell? That doesn't give you the right to invade, let alone start bombing children. Russia has no moral standing in Ukraine whatsoever, but some conservatives, like Tucker Carlson, keep trying to insist that there's a moral gray area here. It's not. There's a tyrannical dictatorship, anti-democracy dictatorship, invading mainland Europe, a country bordering NATO allies, and also sending a terrible signal to China. I mean, look how worried everyone is now about Taiwan being invaded by China off the back of this interaction with Ukraine and Russia. I'm sure they're watching it very closely. Tucker Carlson is also one of the conservatives that's contributed to Republican misconceptions about COVID-19, thinking the vaccine is dangerous. I mean, millions of people have taken the vaccine. I don't see how you could possibly think it's dangerous. There's also this idea that masking isn't effective, or that it's tyrannical to have to wear a mask in some way. It's really not an inconvenience at all. It is at least mildly effective, and there's really no reason to throw a fit about having to wear a mask indoors. I mean, I've been to the Philippines, and they make you wear a mask outside in the blazing heat. It's much worse. I can maybe understand being against masking children in schools. There might be some harm that's doing. Republicans have also become very anti-Fauci in a big way, and I think this is largely spearheaded by Paleocons. I think Fauci's doing his best. I think he's been wrong about stuff like the whole surface area thing. Turns out it was mostly transmitted through air follicles, but that's an understandable mistake to make. I don't see why you can't be a little more charitable to Fauci. I don't understand this. Carlson is behind a lot of popular Republican positions that I have a big problem with. Being anti-vax, being pro-Russia, and also just contributing to the radicalization and over-moralization of our political ecosystem. I think I've made my peace on paleoconservatives. I think I've talked enough about them. I do think this is an important concept, an important distinction that's not talked about enough. I think that learning this difference between the two major Republican factions will give you a big boost in navigating politics in future discussions. So thanks guys for listening. Drop a comment or a subscription. I'm a new channel. I love any support. I'll check it out. Peace.